What happens when a man with too much power loses the only person who could control his madness? This is what we're about to find out in the next few minutes. In 65 AD, in the hills of the Palatine, Emperor Nero walked through the marble corridors of his palace, whispering the name of a dead woman. Poppaea Sabina was gone, taking with her not only the heart of the Caesar, but also his last anchor to sanity. What Nero did next wasn't just grief, it was a desperate attempt to resurrect the dead through the living. The story you're about to hear is not about love. It's about what happens when absolute power meets irreparable loss, and how an innocent young boy became the central piece in the most disturbing game of human substitution ever recorded in the history of the empire. In the writings of Tacitus and Suetonius, we find not just facts, but the testimony of an era where the boundary between affection and possession had been completely destroyed. This is the true story of how Nero turned grief into nightmare and a boy into the living ghost of his dead wife. Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus was not just an emperor. He was an artist obsessed with perfection. At 27 years old, he ruled an empire stretching from Britannia to Egypt. But his true passion lay on the stages of Rome, where he recited poetry and sang to audiences who applauded out of fear, not admiration. In his golden palace, among Greek statues and hanging gardens, Nero had built a world where his fantasies became imperial reality. Musicians, poets, and sculptors competed for his attention, creating a court where art and power fused into grand spectacles. But amid this controlled extravagance, there was Poppaea Sabina, described by Tacitus as possessing every beauty except an honest character. Poppaea wasn't just the emperor's wife, she was his muse, his fiercest critic, and paradoxically, the only person in Rome who dared to say no to the Caesar. While senators trembled at a mere gesture from Nero, Poppaea confronted him about his theatrical performances, criticized his compositions, and mocked his excesses. This impossible dynamic, a tyrant subdued by his own wife, created in Nero a dangerous emotional dependency. Poppaea had become not just his companion, but the mirror through which he saw his own greatness. When she died in 65 AD, during a violent argument that resulted in fatal injuries, Nero didn't just lose a wife, he lost his identity. In the months following Poppaea's death, the imperial palace turned into a living mausoleum. Nero ordered that his wife's chambers remain untouched. Her clothes still hung in the wardrobes, her perfume still scented the rooms, her jewels still sparkled on marble tables. But preserving objects did not fill the void that consumed the emperor. It was during one of the endless funeral ceremonies that Nero noticed a young man among the palace servants. Sporus was about 15 years old, with golden hair that captured the Mediterranean light and delicate features that disturbingly resembled the profile of Poppaea engraved on the empire's coins. What began as casual observation quickly turned into imperial obsession. Nero summoned Sporus for private audiences, initially justified as special services to the imperial household. The young man, born a slave and later freed, had no choice but to obey the emperor's summons. In the early weeks, these meetings consisted only of long conversations in which Nero spoke about Poppaea, describing her gestures, her voice, her preferences. Gradually, the summons became more specific. Nero began asking Sporus to wear Poppaea's clothes, to walk like her, to arrange his hair in the same elaborate style his wife had popularized among Roman matrons. When Sporus hesitated or showed discomfort, he was gently reminded that his life depended entirely on imperial generosity. The alliance was sealed, not by choice, but by survival. What happened in the following months went beyond the limits of symbolic replacement and entered the territory of systematic forced transformation. Nero summoned the best doctors and surgeons in Rome for an unprecedented task in imperial history. Suetonius's records reveal that the emperor was no longer satisfied with superficial similarities. He wanted a full physical recreation. Sporus underwent medical procedures that permanently altered his appearance and physiology. The historical records, though discreet due to the sensitive nature of the topic, indicate surgical interventions intended to fully feminize the young man, including the removal of his primary male characteristics. For months, Sporus remained confined in the imperial chambers under constant medical care and strict surveillance. Nero visited daily, supervising every step of the transformation and giving specific instructions on how the boy should be shaped to perfectly match the memory of Poppaea. Simultaneously, specialized tutors were assigned to teach Sporus Poppaea's mannerisms, her way of walking, her elegant gestures, and even her distinct speech patterns. Every movement was rehearsed, every facial expression practiced to perfection. The imperial palace had become a macabre theater where the boundary between mourning and madness had completely vanished. Servants whispered in the hallways about training sessions that lasted for hours, in which Nero obsessively corrected every detail that didn't match his memories of Poppaea. Within a year, Sporus no longer existed. In his place, a ghostly version of a dead woman now walked the halls of the imperial palace. By 67 AD, 2 years after the beginning of the transformation, Sporus had become a masterpiece of human reconstruction, and at the same time, a living testament to physical and psychological deterioration. The imperial doctors kept detailed records of the complications resulting from the procedures. Recurring infections, chronic pain, and extreme bodily fragility marked the daily life of the young man, who now answered only to the name Sabina, a direct homage to the late empress. Sporus's public appearances revealed the brutal cost of Nero's obsession. During imperial banquets, he remained at the emperor's side, dressed in Poppaea's embroidered tunics, wearing her jewelry and perfume. Yet attentive observers noted his stiff posture, the result of physical limitations caused by the body modifications, and his perpetually distant expression, clear signs of deep psychological trauma. Tacitus records that Sporus rarely spoke during these events, limiting himself to forced smiles and mechanical gestures that had been meticulously rehearsed. His health visibly declined. Pale skin, dramatic weight loss, and occasional tremors exposed a body in collapse. Nero, in turn, seemed oblivious to the obvious suffering of his creation. To him, the project had been a complete success. Sporus was his resurrected Poppaea, his most complex artistic masterpiece, the proof that even death could be overcome by imperial will. During official ceremonies, Nero presented Sporus as his wife, demanding that senators and dignitaries treat the young man with all the honors due to the position of empress. The imperial court, trapped between horror and political necessity, complied with the demands in awkward silence. Sporus's body had become a living monument to unlimited power and unrestrained madness. The year 68 AD brought the inevitable collapse. The military revolts that swept through the empire forced Nero into suicide. But his most disturbing legacy remained alive in the fragile figure of Sporus. When the Praetorians stormed the palace, they found the young man in the imperial chambers, still dressed in Poppaea's clothes, completely disoriented about his own identity. The new rulers faced an unprecedented administrative dilemma: what to do with someone who had been systematically stripped of his original humanity. Sporus survived Nero's fall, but his post-imperial existence proved even more tragic. Historical records indicate that he tried to reclaim some semblance of a normal life, but the irreversible physical modifications and deep psychological trauma made that transition impossible. During the subsequent reigns of Galba and Otho, Sporus was kept at court as a living historical curiosity, a walking testament to the excesses of Nero. Suetonius reports that some later emperors used him as evidence of their predecessors' madness, displaying him during political trials as proof of the previous regime's atrocities. Sporus's death, which occurred around 69 AD, was only marginally recorded by the chroniclers of the time. His identity had been so completely destroyed and rebuilt that historians couldn't even determine his exact age at the time of his death. Paradoxically, it was through this total obliteration that Sporus achieved a perverse form of historical immortality. His case became the ultimate example of how absolute power can turn personal grief into systematic human tragedy. Today, when we look at the marble busts of Poppaea Sabina in museums around the world, we are not only seeing the face of a dead empress, but also the memory of a young man whose real name was lost forever, sacrificed on the altar of imperial obsession. The story of Sporus remains an eternal warning. Some forms of love are indistinguishable from the most refined cruelty.